Welcome to EPG Pathshala. The course that we are going to discuss today is Social Policy, and the specific module under discussion is Gender in Social Policy. My name is Sohini Sengupta and I am a faculty in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. The social protection agenda was developed with the main idea of uplifting the poor and including those who are vulnerable and including people who have been historically marginalized in societies. And these people are differentiated on the basis of age, health status, and so on. Such an emphasis, either intentionally or unintentionally, had left out women as a socially marginalized category. Despite some measures that were targeted at women-headed households, gender had rarely been used as a differentiating lens to understand poor people's differential exposure to risk and vulnerability. So that, and we need to have such a lens in order to design social protection measures that take into account the diverse ways in which men and women experience social insecurities. The objectives of this module is to enable students to reflect on the relationship of social policy and gender, to understand concepts and theories for gender analysis of social policy in a global and comparative context, to understand the importance of gender on development and poverty reduction. Let us look at the broader understandings that have grown in terms of how gender as a concept influences development. Women are a majority of the world's population but receive a small portion of its opportunities and benefits. Denial of right to work and political participation to women act as an obstacle to their health and flourishing. The quality of life of human beings is determined by their status of health, education, political liberty and participation, employment and self-respect. In all of these accounts, one would find differential experience of whether one is men or women. The Human Development Index that uses criteria such as longevity, health status, educational opportunities, employment and political rights show that women's quality of life was poorer as compared to men in the same social and economic situation. All over the world, there is also the issue of missing women, lower sex ratio, higher mortality rate for girls and women, which indicate bias, discrimination and neglect in almost all societies in the world towards women. Gender inequality, men and women face various yet different kinds of constraints and barriers that limit their opportunities to better themselves. Such constraints may be gender specific, whereby societal norms and practices apply to women or men by virtue of their gender. Constraints may also be gender intensified, which essentially means that the inequalities that different members of the household experience around, say for example, distribution of basic resources like food or healthcare or access to property and so on, could be differently experienced by men and women. It may also be gender imposed, which essentially means that forms of gender inequality and disadvantage reflects the discrimination that exists in the wider domain. Gender is also closely related to poverty. Gender inequality results in women and girls being disproportionately represented among the extreme poor, resulting in women having limited access to labor market, or be forced to take on casual or more insecure forms of employment, or being employed in the informal economy, and which are devoid of all forms of social protection. Although there is considerable variation in gender-related design features of social protection programs, all programs have intended or unintended effects on women and gender relations. Unpaid care work constitutes one of those invisible areas of society which contributes a great deal to the quality of life that women lead, and which is increasingly being considered as a key social policy concern. Unpaid care work includes a wide spectrum of domestic tasks as well as care for people at home and in the community. This form of work is generally not recognized in national accounts and is often undervalued and overlooked by policymakers and legislators. Estimates reveal that unpaid care work would constitute between 10 to 50% of GDP if it was assigned an economic value. Women and girls spend most time on such work, which may restrict their education and their ability to participate in the labor market and to have a free and independent lives of their own. Gender differences in economic opportunities are often interpreted or measured in terms of labor market participation. Significant progress has been attained in women's labor force participation in the last decades. However, gaps remain. Persistent gender difference on labor productivity and earning is one example of such a gap. Women and men not only perform different economic activities in the labor market, the entire structure of labor market is believed to be segregated by gender, such that women are always involved in certain specific low status, low paid, insecure forms of employment in the labor market. If you look at the female labor force participation trends in the context of India, from 1980 to 2009, female labor force participation rate worldwide rose from 50.2% to 51.8%. When we look at the labor force participation rates in some specific corners of the world, we see that in such places it is actually lower than world standards. So in Middle East and North Africa, only 26% of women. In South Asia, only 35% women participate in the labor force. Comparatively, in East Asia and Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, higher number of women are in the labor force as compared to the global average. Rising education, declining fertility, and higher levels of education should all be associated with increasing labor force participation of women. However, the trends from India are contrary. If you remember our module on health policy, we discussed how fertility rates have been declining. If you remember our module on education policy, you'll remember that education levels are increasing in the context of India. A combination of these two factors should have meant that more and more women are participating in the labor force. On the other hand, what the data shows is the exact opposite. Female labor force participation rates have been traditionally low in India compared to all parts of the world. In 1994, India ranked 68th out of 83 countries. In 2012, it ranks 84th out of 87 countries. This follows from a recent sharp decline in women's labor force participation rate. The NSSO survey conducted in 2009-10 showed that the labor force participation for women aged 15 and above fell by 10% point as compared to the previous round, which implies that 22.6 million fewer women in the labor force in 2010 than 2005, despite high GDP growth and of 8% and the implementation of public works program like the MGNREG. There are several explanations for why women's labor force participation rate is declining. One is the education effect, which essentially means that increasing number of young women are now attending educational institutions, because of which they are not participating in the labor market. Income effect. As households become wealthier in the context of India, increasing number of women move out of subsistence, insecure and low status employment and become economically inactive, because this is considered to be more respectable. Measurement methods. Changes in measurement precision across NSSO surveys could have contributed some amount of discrepancy to this data. The other explanation, for which there is quite a large number of support from the social policy proponent, is the shrinking labor market. Declining employment opportunities for women, rising working age population, increasing competition with men, and the reluctance to take up poorly remunerated work, all of this may have contributed to less number of women being counted in the labor force. Looking at this data, whatever may be the reason for women not working as much today in the labor force as they used to do in the past in the context of India, what we need to understand is the structural barriers that women experience when they try to work in any labor market. According to a 2014 ILO report, structural characteristics of the labor market play a great role in the recent large decline of female labor force rate in India. Among these structural barriers, which are social structural barriers, are norms that restrict women's labor market option, which means that women can only work in certain types of occupations which are more gender specific. Consistent decline in agricultural employment. That essentially means, if you remember our module on agrarian issues, we did discuss how farmers and the agricultural sector as such is in crisis. If agriculture is not generating as much employment as it did in the past, then one of the groups which would suffer significantly are the women who were mostly employed in rural areas in agricultural activity. Gender-based discrimination and occupational segregation again means that women can only perform certain types of work. Slow growth in salaried and wage employment and rising informal sector work generates a great deal of competition, which essentially means that as more and more girls and women are emerging out of educational institution, it's not necessary that they're finding suitable employment in the labor market. Household poverty and economic activity. Rural poverty in India is associated with landlessness, rural wage labor, and caste. Throughout the 20th century, there was a broad decline in self-cultivation as the main source of rural employment. While men have diversified into non-agricultural activities, both in the rural sector and in the case of urban economy, women remain largely confined to rural areas, which essentially means not as many women are migrating as men. But if you look at our migration data, that's not what it says. If you look at the census migration data, you'll see large number of women migrating, and that essentially is because when women marry in the context of India, they actually move homes, and that gets recorded as migration. But migrating for work from rural to other rural areas or from rural to urban areas is not something that women are doing as much as men. Women from landless poor households are mainly found in agricultural wage employment, which is the least well-paid work in the economy. Women from higher caste groups face more restrictions, and this is reflected in their even lower labor force participation. One of the key concepts in the context of gender and social policy is the feminization of agricultural labor. Feminization of agricultural labor is what this concept actually means is larger number of women are filling the ranks of agricultural wage labor, which is the least remunerative and the least respectable occupation in rural areas. Loss of land for cultivation, inadequate growth of productive employment opportunities on family farms, spread of green revolution technology since the 1960s led to increase in productivity and demand for labor. This essentially led to greater increases in female labor. So women started working in farms during the green revolution era because productivity increased and there was a new demand for labor, and that was also the time when many men moved from farm to non-farm economic activities. Decline in rural non-farm employment with reduced government spendings in rural development program has increased the casual wage employment of women. Wage gap and household poverty. One of the reasons, of course, why women-headed households are poorer than male-headed households, or rural communities where most women work in agriculture is poorer than, say, urban communities, is because poor women are essentially paid lesser than men. While their incomes may be sufficient to meet household basic needs, it's never enough to pull households out of poverty. In fact, one of the key indicators to identify poor rural households was essentially to try and understand if the head of the household was a woman or a man. That was enough to determine whether households were living in deprivation or were doing well. Absence of male earners compound the situation, increasing the risk of household poverty. Real agricultural wages for women have risen in all regions, and this is attributed to green revolution technologies. Effective education, increase in public sector employment has also contributed to narrowing the wage gap. However, this has mostly benefited better off households, and this has benefited men more than women. So essentially the difference in wage gap between men and women is quite a complex issue, and it affected different classes of women and women belonging to different socio-economic groups differently in the context of India. A large number of women also work in urban informal economy. Poorer women tend to be concentrated in the most casual segments of the urban informal economy. If we look at women's labor force rates in urban areas, it tends to be less than men and rural women. It's easier to combine subsistence and paid work in rural areas because you have access to some form of productive resources. You might have livestock, you might have a bit of land, or you might have access to forests. Working in urban areas actually requires greater mobility, different types of skills, some amount of financial capital, and the ability to deal with officials. Traditionally, women have lacked in all of these skills. It is, on the other hand, the kind of work that women do in the context of urban informal economy, it tends to be home-based, subcontracted paid work in small and medium enterprises. Now, these types of works are also very difficult to make visible or to count or to measure. So one really does not know the extent of work that women do in the urban informal economy because much of their work remains invisible and also poorly remunerated, and they may be working in very poor working conditions. Seclusion of women in extreme patriarchy regions explains the lower labor force participation of women. Working in public domain, wage employment for others results in loss of status of women and their household. Poverty may force women to work outside home, and household prosperity may result in their withdrawal from workforce. Since seclusion and absence of women from public domain is considered to be such a respectable thing in the context of many societies in the world which promote patriarchal values, women not working in the marketplace may be seen, could be seen as an indicator of household well-being or prosperity. Home-based economic activities are sometimes both socially and statistically invisible, and since these are treated as extension of domestic chores. These are, however, also the least well-paid areas of work and least secure in terms of any type of social insurance or social protection. Public sector employment is highly respectable, and it also comes with good labor standards, equal opportunity laws, social insurance, and so on. However, the accessibility is limited and scarce, especially since there's also a great deal of disparity in literacy rates among women and men. Therefore, to summarize, what are the gender-specific constraints once more? Powerful social norms that restrict mobility in public domain, confining women to home-based activities. Primary responsibility for household tasks and children, which is essentially caring responsibilities which are unpaid. Ideas about masculinity and femininity that leads to gender-differentiated returns to labor essentially means for the same type of work, women and men may be paid different wages. Control by senior men on the labor of women and younger men, gender inequalities in access to and control over land and property, gender inequalities in access to and attainment in education, gender bias in state provision of extension, credit, and other services, since women farmers are not recognized as autonomous entities who also take farming decisions. Now, globalization. Globalization, as we have discussed in the past, leads to certain types of new challenges as well as new opportunities for women in all societies, including in India. The gender division of labor in most societies is based on men being the primary income earners and women taking the primary responsibility for domestic and childcare activities. As women enter the labor force, they combine productive work with their reproductive activity. Often there is a social acceptance for women as flexible workers who can carry a burden of multiple roles. Now let's try and understand how this creates new types of constraints for women in a globalized economy. While women's work may be better valued in a globalized context where there are new types of work opportunities emerging, it is also in an extremely insecure areas of work, and the value of women is that they may agree to work in less protected or less paid or less in conditions where labor standards are not being respected. Rising female employment and increasing insecurity of male employment is putting pressure on the traditional gender division of labor. There may be actually more work for women available in certain sectors as compared to men. Requirement of global production that this workforce is temporary helps to maintain the prevailing gender division of labor. And how does it do it? It's essentially because women are not only women are not only forced to work in these temporary types of work because they have to balance unpaid care work and household duties, and because traditionally they have always been part-time workers, it is also now made to appear as though part-time work is a great thing to be and flexible labor is a great idea, because that's what the global market economy and the global production systems require, which actually makes women as ideal workers, but it probably does nothing to create better social protection and make them enable access to better labor standards and other forms of insurance and social protection measures for them. One of the ways in which we can look at this is, although the value of women is increasing in the globalized context, the value of women workers, and more women are being encouraged to participate in the market economy, what we need to understand is, where are the women located in what is described as the GVC, or the global value chain? When we look at worldwide, in the textile and garment industries, women represent over 3/4 of garment workers, 90% in countries like Cambodia, 85% in Bangladesh, and 70% in China. In textile and garment industries, women predominate as workers. In agriculture and horticulture, where women have traditionally played a large role, women constitute 45% of low-skilled workers. In horticultural plants, globally, 75 to 85% of workforce in floriculture and banana plantation. In electronics, 50% of the workforce in mobile phone production, and in tourism, 70% of the workforce in lower level positions. And which essentially means that all these sectors in the globalized economy do offer a preferential opportunity for women workers to move away from their domestic sphere and participate in the labor force. However, there are certain amounts of inequalities that inhere in the global value chain itself, one of which is occupational segregation. Women again tend to dominate in the lower status, poorly paid, insecure, casual segments. For example, in the apparel industry, most women are assembly workers. Men are line production and senior managers. Vulnerable workers, young migrant children, indigenous people have high dependence on employers, and they're highly susceptible to exploitation at workplace. Girl child workers in India's garment supply chain are an example of this, a category of highly insecure and vulnerable workers. Women are also doing what is described as precarious work in small workplaces which are invisible in the supply chain, which do not provide living wages. And if you remember our module on labor laws, essentially in sweatshops and under unsafe working. Other inequalities in the global value chain, which seems to resemble the informal economy, is poor access to maternity rights and childcare, domestic and childcare responsibilities, termination of contract for pregnant women, no provisioning of healthcare, childcare, transportation, maternity or paternity leave. All of this would enable to create a better workplace for women and enable them to balance their paid and unpaid work. Long working hours to meet production deadlines, last-minute changes in order, unsafe working condition, working in cramped places, being susceptible to accidents due to fire or building collapse, lack of freedom of association, which essentially means not forming unions, not organizing, and for fear of losing their jobs. Essentially, what women supply in the global value chain is an army of docile and disciplined, flexible workers who are happy to work for lower wages in extremely unsafe conditions. What could be the social policy solutions for this kind of a situation? Gender differences in access to economic opportunities arise from deep-rooted social norms about division and responsibility of housework. Therefore, subsidies to or public provisioning of childcare would go a long way in ensuring that women are able to bargain better in the marketplace. Improvement in infrastructure services, water, electricity, which would free up women's time which are spent on domestic chores. Better transport networks to manage multiple burdens, which essentially means that if women are to continue to balance their multiple responsibility, then public investment in water, sanitation, transportation, and provisioning of childcare would go a long way in enabling women to obtain more secure forms of employment. Women farmers and entrepreneurs have less restricted or insecure access to land and other resources and credit as compared to their male counterparts. Strengthening women's land ownership rights by reforming discriminatory property laws, correcting biases in service delivery institutions such as government land registration offices, targeting women specifically for land redistribution programs such as encouraging joint titling, improving the functioning of credit markets, and encouraging microcredit programs can all work towards visibilizing the role that women play in agricultural activities in the country and allow them to emerge as stronger and more economically empowered stakeholders in this process. Addressing labor market discriminations, underrepresentation of women in certain sectors reinforce employer biases, and lack of access to specific networks prevents women from accessing non-traditional types of occupation. Active labor market policies such as training, placement, other types of support may encourage women to enter into newer and emerging forms of occupations in the labor market. Affirmative action policies to ensure increased participation in waged employment, which provides greater security, would enable women to move out of insecure, temporary types of employment in the informal economy. Removing discriminatory clauses in labor laws would also help women to access more secure employment. Before we end, let us quickly have a look at the different kinds of occupations, the diversity of the kind of work that women do, which provides them with a living but not a very great living standards, and definitely does not provide them with the opportunity to promote themselves or their households out of poverty. Women workers in a ginger factory in Kerala, sorting and drying and stocking ginger. That's the image. Women working as stone crushers, women picking kendu leaf, which is also used for making Indian cigarettes, women vending vegetables in Assam, women carrying fuel wood in Uttarakhand. The interesting thing about this image is, if you've noticed that there are a lot of this is an urban location and there is no dearth of motor vehicles and other improved forms of transportation. Nevertheless, women are carrying large loads of fuel wood on their back and not using any other forms of transporting fuel wood. Here women are doing Zardozi embroidery in Hyderabad, which is a kind of informal sector work. Here you can see this is an image from Bangladesh where women are engaged in wild shrimp larva collection, and this constitutes the lowest rung of the global value chain in the high value shrimp and fisheries industry in the context of Bangladesh. And with this we come to an end of this module on gender and social policy. What we have learned here is that gender constitutes one of the basic divisions in society, which leads to highly differential outcomes for women and men in the labor market and in other forms of attainment in education, health, and living standard. Social policies can contribute to this situation only if they recognize the fundamental difference in which women and men experience their lives. Thank you.